All That's Left is made possible by our Patreon supporters. To help us continue this work, please consider contributing at patreon.com/leftvoice and make sure to visit our website at leftvoice.org. Welcome, comrades, to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. Today is Earth Day, and this year the occasion comes just weeks after the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issued a grim report on the state of the planet. The IPCC report highlights that there's now only a narrow chance of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, the target that countries set during the 2015 Paris Accords. In fact, we're on track to double this temperature rise by the end of the century, and we're getting dangerously close to tipping points that could have irreversible consequences for the climate. Of course, the deadly consequences of climate change, like droughts, floods, extreme heat waves, are already here and have already touched all corners of the globe. But the people who are disproportionately harmed are the global working class, especially in the global south. Especially the poor, especially indigenous people, and people of color. For example, just this week, flooding in South Africa has killed at least 400 people and displaced over 40,000. Also this week, the UN World Food Programme reported that at least 20 million people in the Horn of Africa are at risk of starvation due to drought. And in the US and Canada, protests are continuing against pipeline expansions like the Line 3 project, that would destroy indigenous lands. These are the people across the world who will continue to bear the biggest brunt of climate inaction, or, to put it more accurately, climate destruction. Governments across the world, especially imperialist governments in the global north, have repeatedly failed to take meaningful climate action. Their pledges are and have been incredibly weak, and the gap between even these promises and reality is extremely vast. Here in the US, which is one of the world's biggest CO2 emitters, Republicans and Democrats alike have presided over years of environmental destruction. The right has largely denied climate change, and the more extreme sectors that do recognize it see the solution as clamping down on borders and hoarding resources, once again putting the global poor and working class in the path of destruction. Democrats, meanwhile, have only ever done just enough and paid just enough lip service to climate policies to quell unrest and win votes at the ballot box. The Biden administration has at this point largely abandoned climate legislation and is now calling for even more domestic fossil fuel production in the face of the war in Ukraine. But as we'll discuss in our episode today, the crisis of climate change isn't due to bad politicians. This isn't a human-made disaster, it's a capitalist disaster. And there's no way to get out of it by going about business as usual, thinking that all we have to do is buy more electric cars. A fossil fuel-based economy is just not compatible with a future for humankind. But we can't give way to climate nihilism, because there is a way out, but not a way out that depends on capitalism. To discuss these topics and the task for the left when it comes to climate change, I'm joined today by Robert Belano. Rob is a Left Voice member who lives in the Washington, D.C. area and writes about climate change and international politics. I will link to his excellent pieces and to other articles in the show notes. So Rob, happy Earth Week, happy Earth Day, and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Oden.
So in the introduction to this episode, I discussed the sort of dismal status quo as outlined by the IPCC report in particular. And I wanted to start by asking kind of a basic question, but one that is kind of big, I would say, and gets to the heart of our discussion, which is, how have we gotten to this point?
Right. Well, I'll say first that we're in a quite dire scenario. Of course, even if all the world's countries fulfill their current pledges, we are still in a scenario of about 2.7 degree warming by the end of the century. And that, of course, is a catastrophic prospect for hundreds of millions of people. It's going to mean devastating heat waves on a regular basis. It's going to mean many coastal cities underwater, the extinction of hundreds of thousands of species or more, and so on. And the notoriously conservative IPCC recently released a report saying that there are just 3 years left for us to change course. Now, the political class, whether Democrats or Republicans, has failed and continues to fail to take the emergency seriously. More than half of all greenhouse gas emissions since the mid 18th century have occurred in just the past 3 decades. And so that includes not just presidencies like those of Trump or Bush, but also of Biden, of Obama, of Clinton, and so on. And so while there was a more or less steady decline in oil and gas output since the mid 1970s, both of these began to skyrocket about a decade ago, and output of both oil and gas is now as high as it's ever been. And I'll say too that there was some belief among many, including some on the left, that the Biden administration would represent a break from these trends. Noam Chomsky famously said that Biden represented the most left climate program ever presented by any president. But that clearly hasn't materialized. Biden has opened up hundreds of thousands of acres of public land for drilling. He famously greenlit the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota, and we're seeing many demonstrations in response to that right now, being led by Indigenous people. The Biden administration granted more drilling permits on average in its first 2 years than the Trump administration did in its last 2 years. And there was a lot of fanfare over the Biden administration's increase in, or the Biden administration's infrastructure plan, but that only put an additional $500 billion toward climate change mitigation over the next 10 years. And as a bit of context, that's not even 1/10 the amount that's expected to be put toward military spending in the same time.
Yeah, it's incredible you say that Biden has, failed on these measures, and it's really interesting that Noam Chomsky and a lot of people on the left were heralding him as, I believe they called him transformative, the new FDR, and things like that. But it really is incredible. Like the bar was already extremely low when it came to the climate, and yet Biden could not even reach this floor level bar for mitigating the climate at all, pretty much.
Right. No, he didn't. And, really shouldn't come as a huge surprise given that it's the same person who said we're not going to get rid of fossil fuels for a long time, and served as vice president during the Obama years when Obama boasted about creating enough oil and gas lines to encircle the globe several times over. So Biden is more or less following in the footsteps of Obama with respect to the climate and failing to take any meaningful action.
But something that you learn on the left, and I remember I was kind of learning when I started becoming a socialist, is that really it is the system that is extremely at fault here. So there is capitalism is not able to find a solution to this crisis precisely because of the fact that capitalism has gotten us into it. Could you say more about what it is about capitalism more generally that has really created this problem?
Yeah. So capitalism requires the production of ever greater numbers of commodities to sustain itself. That's the logic on which capitalism is based. And that ever expanding production requires greater and greater energy inputs. And so in that context, fossil fuels were an ideal energy source. Since they had an extremely high energy return on investment. Now, what's happened is over time, as the stock of fossil fuels has become depleted, ever greater amounts of energy are required to extract it, and at the same time, we see a decrease in the outputs. So there's a trend in decline on energy return on investment, but fossil fuels remain a profitable commodity. They are, they represent billions and billions of dollars of investments that have already been made, and that capitalists can only recoup their investments through the extraction and burning of these fossil fuels. I think it's important to note that other sources of energy did exist. Capitalism, in fact, tried out alternative sources of energy. Water power has existed for hundreds of years, far longer than industrial capitalism. But it came with several disadvantages from the standpoint of capital. This is something that Andreas Malm talks about in his great book, Fossil Capital. So a big problem with water-powered production was that it required immense cooperation between mills that existed along the same stream, cooperation between those upstream and downstream, those that had a steady source of energy and those that had experienced an interrupted flow of energy. And this cooperation, this planning is, of course, anathema to capitalist production. Capitalism is based on competition above all else. So the development of the steam engine, burning coal, allowed each mill to operate around the clock without any coordination between the surrounding mills. And now this transition to fossil fuels brought along with it an additional big advantage. It allowed the source of energy to be transported to centers of production rather than moving production to the source of the energy, as was the case with water or wind. And the result of this was that production could be centered in the cities, where there was an enormous industrial reserve army of labor, that is to say, the unemployed. And so capital was able to drive down the cost of labor power by centering production in the cities. So fossil fuels were central to imposing labor discipline and keeping wages low. I think this contradiction between ecological sustainability and capitalist production, the production based on commodities, was recognized a long time ago. It was recognized over a century and a half ago by Marx and Engels, both of which noted that capitalism went hand in hand with contamination, with poor public health, with ecological destruction. Marx, of course, called this a rift in the natural metabolism between society and nature. And this was something that was developed in the past few decades by authors like John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett. But Marx saw it 150 years ago, that capitalism is a fundamentally unsustainable.
Yeah, I think I've heard people describe it as capitalism requires infinite growth on a finite planet, and this is just so fundamental to capitalism that you can't get around that or find climate solutions around that. And it's also interesting to hear you say that there were some alternatives discussed before, and how the cooperation necessary for water power was a big problem, because what we're seeing now is that the type of coordination, the type of cooperation that we need across countries to get out of this crisis is, again, just not going to happen under capitalism.
Right, absolutely. I mean, capitalism is governed by short-term profit, by the profit of individual capitals, and so um, it's not something that's compatible with long-term planning, with large-scale cooperation, um, and so it can't serve the needs of society as a whole. Um, it operates only in service of a tiny minority to the detriment of the rest of us and the planet.
In a moment, I want to return to this discussion of like how to solve the crisis and the differences that certain leftist sectors have in terms of how to actually resolve the climate crisis. But first, I wanted to get onto a slightly different topic, which is that, I mean, as socialists, we know that a lot of the problems we face aren't, completely isolated, can't be totally disentangled. And we know that things that seem to be different issues are often actually really intimately related to each other. And so one other obvious thing that's, happening in the news right now is the war in Ukraine. And one thing that I think is really under discussed when it comes to climate change is the effect of the war in Ukraine on countries' climate policies, like notably Joe Biden's climate policies, and on climate devastation itself. Could you talk a little bit about that, the connection between the war in Ukraine, imperialism, and the climate?
Sure. Um, so to begin with, uh, the U.S. military is, of course, the largest polluter on the planet, um, both in terms of the amount of carbon emissions that come from the military, but also the countless deadly chemicals that it releases on a regular basis around the world. Left Voice has written a bit about this, and I recommend folks checking out some of the articles that we have on this, particularly by Sam and others. But so any increase in spending as a result of militarization is only going to increase carbon emissions, increase contamination that we see. Then, of course, there's the aspect that with the increase in oil prices as a result of sanctions being placed on Russia and the inability of Russia to export its oil and gas resources around the world, the West, particularly the United States, has responded by increasing its own output of oil and gas. And so there's very little talk these days by the Biden administration of transitioning to renewables. Virtually all the focus is on keeping output as high as possible in order to drive down gas prices. So it's going to have devastating consequences for the world as a whole. And it's important to note that contrary to the narrative put forward by mainstream media, it's not simply a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war in which the United States and its partners in NATO are also heavily involved, and which bear tremendous responsibility for the outcomes, both in terms of the toll on human lives and for the planet as a whole. So it'll have just an enormous impact beyond the end of the war, whenever that happens.
Something I was thinking though is that, with these spikes in prices and with, a lot of European countries being so dependent on Russian fuel and natural gas and things like that, is the war in Ukraine not in any sense serving as a sort of like impetus toward going away from fossil fuels at all. Like, I guess maybe I'm a little bit naive here, but I guess I just feel like this would be a good opportunity for like European governments and the US government to be like, right, I mean, we need to really pivot away from natural gas, oil, coal, and things like that, and really think about renewables.
Well, it would be a logical moment for the United States to take the steps necessary to begin that transition, but that just hasn't been the case. The Biden administration has put all its efforts toward increasing gas and oil outputs by lifting restrictions, by releasing reserves, and so the Biden administration doesn't seem to have any particular interest in speeding up that transition to renewables now.
I suppose I very foolishly assumed that when something logical came along, capitalists and their parties around the world would pursue that course of action. So I apologize for this mistake here.
No, capitalism is a very irrational, illogical, anarchical system.
Totally contradictory. So many on the left, most notably the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, advocate for a Green New Deal approach to solving the climate crisis. And the Green New Deal has also been put forward by other progressives like Bernie Sanders, AOC and the Squad, and a lot of other progressive groups. So this might be kind of a tough question to answer with a lot of precision because, as you've noted before, there isn't exactly like a blueprint for the Green New Deal, not a whole lot of like specific policy detail. But generally speaking, what are the problems with a Green New Deal approach? Could we develop a sort of green capitalism in line with some of the principles that its advocates put forward?
Well, you're right. The Green New Deal, as I see it, is not an alternative. Um, it's essentially a Keynesian plan in which public subsidies would be provided, often to private corporations, to build renewable energy infrastructure. Now, the problem with this is that the same corporations, the same system based on private profit that that led us into our current predicament is expected to take us out of it, and it's a totally utopian idea. One of the biggest boosters of the Green New Deal, Kate Aronoff, has admitted that under this plan, quote, the private sector will be a major part of the transition off fossil fuels. Some people will get rich and some unseemly actors will be involved. Capitalist production will build solar panels, wind turbines, and electric trains. So there's very much an illusion that capitalism can get us out of this situation with the right incentives for major corporations. But historical experience and theory show that this can't be the case, that there is no sustainable capitalism possible, and that capitalism will rely on fossil fuels as long as they remain profitable. So at the very least, we can expect that without a challenge to capitalist production, fossil fuels will be extracted and burned for decades into the future, at least. So it's a very, and I think it shows that a different approach is needed, that what's needed is a response that challenges capitalist production, that we need a system of production that is planned and rational, and necessarily that must be socialist. Now, that's not to say that nothing can be done short of socialism to address the crisis, but what we need are steps that challenge capitalist property ownership. So what we need are the large-scale nationalization of the energy industry, including the fossil fuel companies, controlled by the working class and by consumers. We need a massive public works program, again, directed and controlled by working class and oppressed people. And we need to drastically scale down production using fossil fuels and replace them with a renewable energy infrastructure. But all of this is at least extremely unlikely without challenging the fundamentals of capitalist production.
Yeah, you mentioned the word utopian, and to the point of utopianism, it also strikes me with the Green New Deal that there are these really huge restrictions in terms of actually getting the resources for a lot of these ideas, a lot of these projects that Green New Deal proponents advocate. Some really huge barriers that I feel like they don't really address very much. Like, I was thinking of, like lithium for batteries, all the various materials that you need for solar panels, a lot of the energy that you need to actually get these materials out of the ground and get these, mines and stuff up and running, which could take, like a full decade or more. And there's this article from Commune magazine, I believe, from a few years ago called something like The Devil and the Green New Deal, which is an article that really haunted me at the time, and I do actually still think about it occasionally, even though I have some big disagreements with some of the political implications in particular. But that article does a really good job of talking about the really massive resource requirements that would be required to implement a lot of these Green New Deal ideas. And more specifically, something that's overlooked a lot is the harm that these mines would cause across the world, whether it's, cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo, to China, Bolivia, the lithium mines and things like that. So I think oftentimes there are a lot of oppressed groups and parts of the world, especially in the global South, that would be disproportionately harmed from some of the actions that need to be taken in order to implement something like a Green New Deal.
Right. Well, it'll depend on how production is carried out. I mean, if we follow a model like Tesla's, in which hundreds of thousands of electric cars are produced, it's going to use an enormous amount of lithium and other materials, which potentially bring with them harmful ecological and public health consequences. But if we were to organize production in a way that was rational, in other words, instead of producing hundreds of thousands or millions of electric cars, why not high-speed public transit, particularly rail, which would be a far lighter resource or far less resource consuming than the production of cars. And again, it goes back to the problems inherent in commodity production, in which products are created not to fulfill human needs, but for profit, and so these products also, we can think how many have built-in obsolescence, and which are no longer usable after a few years. So reorganizing production so that we can maximize the energy that we use. We can extract when necessary in a responsible way, and in which products are the products that we rely on are used for years and years or decades, rather than a few months. It would be an entirely different system and have entirely different consequences for people around the world and for the planet.
There's been, I've noticed, a little bit of shift in recent years where people and companies are suddenly forced to actually admit that climate change is happening, and a lot of people at this point can't really close their eyes to the facts that, for example, the IPCC is presenting. But something that I noticed people are now doing kind of instead is this tech utopianism, and really putting forward technology as a solution here, especially something like carbon capture. So I was reading recently that there's this group of technology companies. I think Elon Musk also invested in them, that famous environmentalist who we all look up to, where they have this almost $1 billion initiative to try to increase carbon capture. And actually a lot of oil companies like ExxonMobil are also pushing these kinds of initiatives. I know that you wrote an article recently about the problem with carbon capture in these technologies. Could you describe that a little bit?
Sure. So carbon capture, on the whole, is put forward as a cover for the just horrendous ecological practices being carried out by the largest corporations, and it's a way of delaying any restrictions on fossil fuel production. So as long as there is the idea that carbon will be captured as soon as it's released and put back into the ground, companies feel free to extract and burn as much as they would like. So it's important to note, first off, that the carbon capture technology that exists is extremely limited. All the carbon capture facilities in the world together are not capturing 1% of the carbon dioxide that's currently being released into the atmosphere, and so that's led some, including again some on the left, like Jacobin magazine, to say, well, carbon capture needs to be scaled up drastically. I think one Jacobin writer called for it to be scaled up 1,000-fold, ignoring the energy that's required to build those facilities. But these place no limits on the fossil fuel companies. They're free to continue with the status quo. And beyond that, I think one sort of dirty secret of carbon capture is that most carbon capture facilities that exist are actually putting that carbon back into production for the increased extraction of fossil fuels. It's a process known as enhanced oil recovery, I think it is. So it's a very it's a bait and switch presented to us by the fossil fuel companies, and unfortunately, a number of nonprofits, labor unions, and even, as I say, some of the left have bought into this as a solution. But it's not a way of reducing carbon emissions. And beyond that, even beyond carbon emissions, there's enormous ecological consequences of drilling, particularly of methods developed in recent decades like fracking. So it's not simply about the carbon emissions, but the consequences for water, for other harmful contaminants that are released. There's a number of consequences of oil and gas drilling that go beyond CO2.
Yeah, I think that's something that also is a little bit under discussed when it comes to technologies to extract carbon and things like that from the atmosphere. That we also need radical change to prevent things like pollution, overfishing, species extinction, which is a huge issue that we haven't even touched on, and things like that. I mean, I'm also struck though hearing you talk about this and hearing you talk about enhanced oil recovery, that like the marketing here and the euphemisms are just absolutely stunning, absolutely world class marketing and PR laundering going on here for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. They've got expert teams working on the greenwashing of their practices, and like I say, unfortunately, a lot have bought into it. But that's all it is greenwashing, fundamentally dangerous practices.
So you've already mentioned some of the steps that we need to fight for to get out of the crisis that we're in, and you've mentioned nationalizing fuel companies, reorganizing production, extracting only when necessary and in more responsible ways. What are the tasks ahead of us, and what are some other like specific steps that we should really fight for at the current juncture?
Yeah. Well, I think there's on one hand, it seems a very uh, dire, as I said at the beginning, but at the same time, we have seen victories for working class and oppressed people in recent years. I think most notably this year was the Amazon victory um, in New York at the Staten Island facilities. And these struggles do not exist independently. It is working class people, people of color, the poor who face the greatest consequences of both the climate emergency and the various other ecological crises that we're seeing. And so um, a movement is necessary that links both climate with the legitimate demands of working people, of people of color. And it's a movement that can win. We represent, of course, the vast majority of the planet, whereas those who benefit from the current system represent only a tiny portion of the population. And victories like those of Amazon, with all their limitations, show that working class can win. And I'll say that what is needed also is a socialist perspective, um, an understanding that capitalism cannot provide us the way out, that we will not be able to um, elect so-called progressive Democrats who will legislate a transition to renewables and out of the climate emergency. What's needed is an independent movement with an independent political force representing those most affected. And I see that as a party of the working class. But that's not limited to economic demands. That takes up all of the demands of oppressed people and links them together. And that ultimately is the only way out that I see.
For sure. And I would also add that I think it's really important to try to fight climate anxiety turning into climate nihilism. I find myself falling into this pattern sometimes. Like I almost like reflexively just like cover my eyes when I see a news story come out about like the rainforest and destruction and things like that. But I mean, we really can't fall into this mindset that there's nothing to do, and fall into this mindset of like, oh well, screw it, we might as well throw it all away, because this is really what capitalists and what these corporations want, and what I mean, we haven't really touched on this, but also what the far right and the so-called like eco-fascist movement and these kinds of groups want. Because like you just mentioned, I mean, there is a lot of things that we can do. And I mean, even preventing like, 1 degree, half a degree of global warming does have really, really huge consequences. Like whether we let, rise of 3 degrees Celsius happen compared to 2 degrees is extremely consequential, especially for people, oppressed people, the working class, and especially for people in the global south who are especially vulnerable to climate change. So I think it's also really important to, not be very Pollyanna-ish and too optimistic about things, but also to not have this attitude of like, well, we missed it, too bad.
Absolutely. That's a great point. And you're right that sort of is the narrative that's generally presented, that there's nothing that we can do as working people, but there have been many instances, countless instances really, of experiences throughout history of working people challenging the plans of the ruling class, and all of the crises that they have brought. Maybe most notable was the war, the conflagration that led ultimately to World War I, which resulted in the deaths of millions of people, and the Russian Revolution, which had as one of its fundamental demands immediate peace. And so Russia withdrew from the war, was able to reorganize production in extremely difficult circumstances in order to meet the needs of its people, and so these crises often go along with moments of revolutionary upsurge. And I think, as socialists, we have to find ways to take part in these movements where they occur, to bring an anti-capitalist perspective to them. As I say, an understanding that capitalism can't provide a way out, but there is an alternative for us, that we're not doomed as we're often told. So while the solution can't come through individual actions, we do have the possibility of transcending the many crises that capitalism has brought with it.
Hell yes. Great way to end it. Rob, this was really great. I learned a lot, and hopefully our listeners did as well. We will link to your excellent climate-related writing in the show notes. But yeah, thank you so much for being here, and we look forward to having you on again in the future.
It was a pleasure. Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, and share the show with your friends, your family, coworkers, classmates, comrades, and anyone else who you want to radicalize. Follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/leftvoice.org, on Instagram at left_voice, and on Twitter at left_voice. And finally, Left Voice is an independent, revolutionary socialist publication, which means that we completely rely on the support of our members and our sympathizers. So that we can continue to bring you more episodes of All That's Left, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftvoice. We're really excited about this project, and we hope that you'll join us on this journey.